This is a conversation about the future of Europe and Ukraine. The United States does not take the European continent seriously. NATO is turning European countries into hostages of the will of the White House leader. We will discuss the dispute between Zelensky and Trump, the crucial steps Europe must take, and the decline of the Euro-Atlantism. Join us as an honorary fellow at the International Center of Defense and Security, Tallinn, and an associate fellow of the Russia and Eurasia Program at Chatham House, London, the esteemed James Sherr.
Hello, James. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, Denis. It's very nice to see you again.
Yesterday, President Zelensky, President Trump, and Vice President J.D. Vance had a very tough conversation in the Oval Office, and President Zelensky left Oval Office, left the United States without any guarantees and without any deal. What is your reaction on this?
The meeting from every point of view was disastrous, but it had, I think, one positive effect. It has removed any ambiguity, any ambivalence about Trump's approach to Ukraine and to this conflict, and there is no justification and no room for illusions anymore. I'm happy to elaborate in the course of the interview, but this will emerge, I think, with your questions.
Can we say that Macron's and Starmer's visits are failure?
Are a failure? No, I don't think so. I'm not surprised that they received no assurance about American security guarantees. If one wants to be realistic, one has to assume there are not going to be any American security guarantees. This is it. America is handing this problem to Europe, and its engagement with Ukraine is going to be very specific. Whether any of it is positive or not, a lot of it will not be positive. We don't know what the sequel to Zelensky's meeting is going to be. And the parts of the meeting with Keir Starmer that were the most successful were related particularly to bilateral British-US relations. And that's that. And the meetings were otherwise somewhat cordial. But, just to make the obvious point from the beginning, they were both treated by Trump with the appropriate level of courtesy. Not completely, for protocol reasons. Trump should have personally come out to meet Macron, but he didn't. He had an anonymous official do that, and he was brought inside. This is not surprising, because protocol is one of these little nuances that Trump basically knows nothing about and cares even less about. So that's that. But with Zelensky, it's perfectly clear that this is, from the very beginning, this is not the sort of treatment accorded to a president or a head of government of a sovereign state. He was being spoken to as a vassal of the United States from the very beginning. So it makes it very clear that Trump does not see Ukraine as a proper state and is not entitled to these courtesies, and there isn't even the slightest pretense of equality in this relationship. Whereas with all his failings, about which I have commented in great detail, when Biden was president, the relationship was in a number of respects an equal relationship, in that when the Ukrainians agreed with an American position, they said so. When they didn't, they very candidly expressed their views. They were listened to. Sometimes the discussion was very frank, at times even harsh, but nobody in Washington regarded the Ukrainians as being impertinent because they disagreed. Whereas from the very beginning, it became perfectly clear that any disagreement on the part of Ukraine is seen as an impertinence as showing a lack of proper courtesy, gratitude, respect, and deference to which the United States is accorded. So this is a fundamental difference. And I haven't even mentioned, in contrast, the way Trump approaches Vladimir Putin. So this entire discussion, in many ways, seemed to be an exercise designed to put Zelensky in his place and, in fact, humiliate him. And it's quite clear this was planned beforehand. This was not, there were spontaneous elements to it. But this approach was basically planned beforehand. And this was one of the purposes of the meeting from the point of view of the Americans.
Maybe this is a provocative intonation of this question, but Europe is now planning to hold another summit in support of Ukraine.
Yes.
Should we expect anything more than a package of standard statements?
That is not important at this point. What is now clear the two things are now very clear in Europe. First, in future, with regard to Europe itself, the United States will be an unreliable and unpredictable ally at best. And even before this meeting, at the time of the Munich Security Conference, some even before that had reached the conclusion the United States from this point forward cannot be considered a proper ally at all. And naturally, there are a variety of views, therefore, about, first, how Europe should approach the United States, but more generally, what conclusions Europe needs to draw from this reality and what it needs to do and what its priorities have to be. Even more than a year ago, very senior British military figures had already arrived at the view that the next war, planning for the next war with Russia, a larger war with Russia, will have to be based on the premise that the United States will not be there. So all of these points have been amply reinforced by what has happened, and everyone now understands that minds need to be focused in a very strategic way and quite rapidly on what Europe, individual states of Europe, and Europe collectively can and must do to provide essential support for Ukraine in the absence of US support. So in Europe, I think the prospect of a complete withdrawal of US support from Ukraine is treated very seriously indeed. So of course this meeting is only going to produce general statements, and some of them might include formats for future meetings and so on and so forth. In my view, and it's not only my view, it is essential that at every level, the appropriate European representatives need to sit around the table with their opposite numbers in Ukraine and work out a plan of what can be done and in what time scale.
Let's talk about Trump and Europe. It's clear that Trump has some skepticism about Europe. What do you think are the reasons behind this skepticism?
I would go further. I would say it's not simply skepticism. I think from the beginning, and one saw this in his previous term, Trump begins with a degree of hostility towards Europe. And he said most recently to Keir Starmer on Monday that he regards the EU, and of course I underscore for your viewers that the UK is not part of the EU anymore, Trump regards the EU as a project to screw the United States. So Trump takes Europe seriously in only one respect, as a trading bloc. And he regards Europe's interest as harshly competitive, if not even incompatible, with US interests. And all the other respects, Trump does not take Europe seriously at all. And the fact that Europe is not included in the American design framework of negotiations makes it clear that this administration does not regard Europe as an equal. It does not take Europe seriously. It has some very clear, in some ways draconian demands, some of which I believe are in Europe's interests when it comes to demands about increasing the level of defenses. But I think it would be a mistake, and it is a mistake that some in Europe have, to believe that if the Europe actually delivers on these expectations, and if in fact European states, or at least most of them, are able to substantially increase the weight of their own defenses, that this will be a precondition for the United States returning to its customary role as a guarantor and as an equal partner in every level. I don't think this is the way the Trump administration sees it. I think they view all of this as the bare minimum to the maintenance of correct relations of any kind, and if anything, they regard it as a prelude and a precondition enabling the United States to leave Europe to its own devices, at least to a very substantial degree. And that was made pretty clear by Defense Secretary Hegseth's comments at the Munich Security Conference. So this has surprised a number of people and come as a shock, but this shock is being absorbed. And I had one other thing, because, and I think you wanted to discuss this at some point. There have been a certain number of nebulous hints from the United States that they are seriously considering withdrawing forces from frontline states, including the Baltic states. Well, of course, where most of the forces are concentrated in the frontline area is Poland. And I know Trump told President Duda that the United States will continue to defend Poland. Посмотрим, we'll see. But the fact that this is even discussed makes it clear that the quarrel is not about the level of defense spending, because it is the Baltic states and Poland, precisely, specifically, that already meet most of Trump's standards for defense, spending well over 3% of GDP on defense, and in some cases, in the case of Poland and Estonia, close to 5%. And so he's talking about withdrawing forces from them anyway. So it becomes clear that this is a much bigger game that the Americans have begun in order to free them up to deal with what they regard as their primary security interests, which are in the Americas, beginning with the southern border of the United States, but elsewhere in the Americas, and in the Far East.
Can we outline the global strategy, maybe, of Trump administration has chosen for Europe?
The Trumpian worldview has some very significant commonalities with the Russian worldview. Trump has no interest in what we call the rules-based international order. For him, that is a complete abstraction. He has no interest in abstractions. He has no interest in any general schema of relations that gives the United States concrete obligations. His approach to all countries is very event-orientated, very transactional. Everything is focused on getting a deal. From Trump's perspective, as from the perspective of Russia, as from the perspective of China, basically it's only very great powers that matter. And as I said, Europe is for some reason not seen as a very great power. Um, and um, and these relations are of importance, and these are the relations that matter to the United States. And where possible, the United States will seek positive uh, deals and arrangements with these powers, uh, which inevitably will come at the expense of smaller powers. And that's the way world politics works. That's the way it should work. And this means basically that the whole setup, the whole расположение that he has in mind for the conduct of relations is fundamentally compatible with that which you would find in Beijing and in Moscow, but it is not compatible with what you would find in Brussels, either inside NATO or inside the European Union. And it is in some respects not even compatible with the provisions of the UN Charter. One of the most chilling statements in his inauguration address on the 20th of January was that the United States would be expanding its territory. Well, this is remarkable. Not even the Russians claim to be doing that. They claim they are restoring what was theirs. But when it comes to the claims on Greenland, the demands on Canada, this is not a joke. This is not a way of just intimidating them so they make certain concrete concessions. It goes beyond that. He had a 40 or 50-minute conversation with Mette Frederiksen, the Danish Prime Minister, about Greenland, which was very unpleasant. And he reiterated several times, we, the United States, will control Greenland. We need it because it's important for our security. The notion that, any innocent person would ask, well, why would you need it? Denmark is an ally. Denmark would actually welcome an increased US military and naval presence in Greenland. Denmark is willing to cooperate with any reasonable security requirement that the United States has, but it is not going to entertain transfer of sovereignty. The notion of sovereignty is not implanted in Trump's mind. He doesn't understand nation states. What he understands is territory.
It's like abstraction for him.
It's an abstraction, territory, property. And the heads of states are property owners. And you negotiate over property. And nothing else really matters to him in any significant way. The Russians have a doctrine that only the strong are capable of exercising real sovereignty and can make a claim to real sovereignty, and the others cannot. This is all nonsense. This is, as the Russians say, idiotism. And Trump's views are very similar to this. This is all of this amounts to a change, not only in US policy, but in the very definition of the United States and what it is and what its core interests are, that is absolutely unprecedented. It would be very difficult to find a precedent for this. This has not been the American approach to international relations for well over 100 years. And certainly everything that's being suggested and proposed in Washington is a fundamental departure from the basic assumptions that have governed relations in the West, at least, for the past 80 years. You'll notice the term the West is never used. This is another abstraction. I mean, what does the West mean? The West means obligations, mutual obligation, mutual dependency, integration to a varying set of degrees about various things, institutions, and common values, and at every level, working together, seeking to maintain the relationship as an end in itself. Trump doesn't care about the relationship as an end in itself. So this is very, very radical. And this is one reason why it's been very difficult for countries of Europe to understand, to appreciate what is actually now taking place. We're dealing with something fundamentally new. And in my view, I am someone who, my whole political life, I have been a very strong Atlanticist. I have been at many levels, at least for my adult political life, a strong European. This means the old categories of thought are not sufficient for us anymore. Europe has to work out what it can do for itself to maintain its essential collective interests and security. Because the United States, you cannot assume the United States is going to be there.
Is second Trump administration is disaster, or maybe it's opportunity for you?
Well, it is what in Russian you'd call a толчок. It's it's an impulse, it's a push, it's a wake-up call, as people say. So it means that we will have to approach our arrangements in a different way. I think Emmanuel Macron understands this very well. The British have more difficulty, but British are also understanding it. Friedrich Merz understands it very well. He gets the point. I think a lot of the people believed in the beginning, well, if you appeal to Trump's ego, to his vanity, if you flatter him, we'll still be able to work with him on something like the old basis. This is a complete illusion. It's a complete illusion. I was very disappointed in the past 24, 48 hours to see Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, basically repeat some of this in his advice to Zelensky, that Zelensky must do everything to find a way to work with Trump. Zelensky needs to focus on Ukraine's real friends, which are in Europe. This is not to say Zelensky should try to antagonize the Americans. Of course not. It's not to say that he should reject accommodation and cooperation where it is possible. Of course not. But his core concern has to be to build really effective relations with those countries that, in fact, are Ukraine's allies and who regard Ukraine's survival, and not minimal survival, but survival as a solid, flourishing, secure, and sovereign state, as important for Europe's interest.
So Europe is entering in turbulent times. In your opinion, is Europe ready for this?
Europe, I think most Europeans, of course, I exclude those who are de facto allies of Russia, like Orban and Fico. And I exclude, of course, factions and parties in other European states, like the AfD in Germany, who are effectively Russian allies. But if you talk about the rest, I think there is now a general understanding that Europe must get ready. It must get ready for working for setting up basically not only a new set of capabilities, but a new system of security. This is not to imply that Europe should abandon NATO in any respect, but we have to understand that anything that is part of NATO now is subject to a US veto. And therefore, NATO is not enough. And that's very difficult for someone like me and for a lot of people who whose whole framework of thought has been based on This is not simply a problem caused by a single president and his most ideological supporters. Trump won. He didn't win the election by a landslide, but he won the election conclusively. He is supported by and large by half the country, and of this half the country, half of those are ideologically very committed. In my institute, we, over the years, have welcomed once or twice a year delegations of so-called staffers, sovietniki, advisors
By
of the US Congress, of both chambers. And it's been very clear for some time that in some of these Trumpian states, there is an adamant, almost defiant indifference to Europe. There is no affection at all. Even if you were to say to them, and I've said it once or twice, that if Ukraine is betrayed, Ukrainians will hate the United States for a generation. A lot of them will just look you in the eye and say, we don't care. And if you say to some of them, much of Europe will hate you for a generation, they'll look you in the eye and say, we don't care. Well, this is very new, but this is the United States we are now dealing with. So even if the Republicans do badly in the midterm elections, even if after 4 years Trump is defeated and he agrees to go, without causing some kind of massive internal disturbances. Even if that happens, we are still left with this problem. You cannot reinvent the security of something like the policy and the strategy of something like the European Union or NATO every 4 years. As long as a large proportion, a potential majority of Americans view the world in this way, then we need different arrangements. We cannot make ourselves dependent on the United States. However much we might cooperate with it, we cannot allow ourselves to be dependent. And freeing ourselves of that dependency is going to require a lot of effort, a lot of sacrifice, a lot of money, and a lot of time.
it looks like it's will last for years in the future.
It might, but on the other hand, if the Trumpian excesses continue to escalate in this way, this whole angry and powerful machine we are dealing with over there could run off the rails before we know it. I mean, I personally think that a peace settlement over Ukraine, even a very unjust, very inadequate one, is extremely unlikely. And at some point, Trump is going to discover that. He's not going to be able to deliver that.
What steps Europe taken to improve its autonomy, its defense and competitiveness?
There needs to be a strategic approach, and we have to arrive at this approach together. It doesn't mean with everybody. It means with like-minded states, which would establish what we can afford to do now, where we can afford, I'm not simply speaking in financial terms, but in practical and political terms, where we can afford to provide more support for Ukraine now, and what needs to be done in future, and what the requirements of these future steps are, what the stages are, what the practicalities are, and what the timing would be. So, in military terms, today, there are several weaknesses that exist in Europe, which will be very, very difficult to overcome, even with much larger defense budgets. One is the fact that the United States provides the vast majority of NATO's airlift, its air transport, its ability to deploy, redeploy, reinforce forces quickly. Most of that is in American hands. Most of the intelligence, military intelligence at an operational and strategic level is in American hands. Then there is the nuclear issue. The British and French nuclear deterrents are designed to perform two functions. They exist as national deterrents of the last resort to deter, in the worst case, direct attacks on national territories. They are also powerful complements of NATO deterrence, but if there isn't going to be NATO deterrence, how do you then extend the range and effectiveness of these deterrents? And this is where what Merz is proposing has a lot of merit. What he is saying is Germany must, without owning nuclear weapons itself, become integrated into the system. And there's another area that needs to be explored, which is for Britain and France to reestablish what we used to have, which are sub-strategic nuclear forces, so that we're not simply tied to a small number of strategic nuclear ballistic missile submarines. There are also sub-strategic, so-called theater range nuclear forces that can be deployed on different platforms. So all of this has to be explored as well. And these are critical issues for Ukraine. Ukraine is very dependent on American intelligence systems. On Starlink, for example. Yes, there are alternatives to Starlink, but it's not as if you could just flick a switch and transfer immediately over to these. This has to be engineered and established. This takes time.
Yes, all frontline works by Starlinks.
But what's needed is a strategic approach. Rhetoric is no longer important. Declarations are no longer important. The question is, what are we going to do in practical terms? Now, in the long term, I'm very optimistic. First of all, Europe is, in economic terms, the near equal of the United States. In technological terms, it is the near equal of the United States, in some respects equal, in some respects better. Long before that was the case, during the period when European economies were still recovering from the Second World War, European states undertook enormous defense efforts, particularly just after the war, when they became aware, in Britain, in France, in Italy, in Germany, there was a more acute awareness of the threat posed by the Soviet Union than there was in the United States, and Europe took the first steps to set up joint defense and security arrangements, which became the prelude to NATO. But when this started, there was no certainty that the United States would join. The United States did not have this expectation after the war. We spent very considerable sums on defense. In 1970, for example, the UK devoted 5.4% of its GDP to defense. During the Falklands operation, more. And then there's been, after this, a steady decline, more or less steady decline for various reasons. But this was at a time when our ability to do these things was not as great as it is now. So I'm very pleased that Prime Minister Starmer has said that Britain will now raise its defense allocation from 2.3 to 2.5% of GDP by 2027. But this is just the beginning of what is needed. And we absolutely can do it. But the public, the electorate, needs to understand why. And this process of education has and of explanation and consultation has barely begun, unfortunately. And we have to understand also, you cannot do this if you maintain peacetime norms about how weapons are produced, about the privileges of a labor force, about the welfare system at every single level. All these things that we do, which add enormously to costs. And we largely have all volunteer forces. A very large part of that US defense budget, which has fallen to 3.3% of GDP, is basically social welfare for soldiers, so that service life is attractive. A year ago, some senior military people in Britain said, we have to return to a form of national service, namely conscription. It can be designed differently from the way it was before, say, in the 1950s, but we absolutely need to do it. And at the time, apart from the people making the suggestion, virtually everybody else who mattered said this is totally unrealistic and not unacceptable. Well, it can't be unrealistic and unacceptable. It's necessary. And here I am in Estonia. We have conscription in Estonia for a year, then reserve obligations. Estonia is a relatively prosperous country. There's no reason we can't do this, and there is a very high level of support for all of this. But people have to feel it. People have to understand what security means. People have to feel they're endangered. And we haven't had that kind of feeling in Europe for a very, very long time. Starmer's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Treasury Secretary, has warned him that any even modest increases in defense spending risk breaching what are called fiscal rules. These fiscal rules were designed for a peacetime environment. That is over. People have to understand this is over. We are in a pre-war situation. People have to understand the paradigm must change, that the old conditions do not exist anymore. So I think, leaving aside all the material and practical demands, which are considerable, the biggest challenge we face is the biggest challenges are intellectual, philosophical, psychological. Once, if we're able to overcome these barriers, we can do the rest. We definitely have the means to do it. And I think Europe on its own, on that basis, once we do it, will be able to deter Russia without the United States and be able to enable Ukraine to defeat Russia without the United States. And I'll just add one thing. Russia is fighting this war in Ukraine on borrowed time. The cost of the war, even to a country that is, to a president who is determined not to pay attention to costs, the costs are enormous, and Putin himself knows. They cannot continue to fight this war in this way for more than another year. This is not hyperbole. I mean, I think he understands this. The economy in Russia is very, very distorted, becoming more distorted by the minute. It's extremely inefficient. With all the extra money they're putting into defense, their defense industry is notoriously ineffective. If it were not for the Chinese contribution to the Russian defense industrial complex, it would be totally unfit for purpose today. So Putin's gamble, which he has started with a great deal of confidence, is we won't need to be doing this for more than another year because Europe won't hold itself together. They are weak, they are fragmented, that's to say, they are morally weak, they lack moral fiber, they will fall apart. And of course, we now have Donald Trump in the White House. And so we can do that. If you change these certainties, you remove them, you change those premises, and it's quite clear. Europe is determined to keep Ukraine alive and keep Ukraine militarily proficient and keep inflicting these terrible casualties on Russia and keep striking Russia where it really hurts, their critical infrastructure, their energy production facilities, their refineries, their weapons depots and production facilities, that once they see that, they will realize we need to draw different conclusions.
In this situation, who might take leadership in this process to become Europe more autonomy, more defensible, maybe, especially with the lame duck situation in some EU countries?
Yeah, but you see, there are many potential leaders about in Europe, and some of them are in very small countries. Trump is not able. Trump is not able to intimidate a female Danish social democratic prime minister, a country of what, 4.5, 5 million people, not able to bend her, not able to intimidate her. They would encounter the same response in any Baltic country. I hope they will encounter that response in Poland. Poland has some very specific problems. They will encounter the same response, and they do in Finland. There now seems to be, if he becomes chancellor, and it's almost certain that he will, a future German chancellor, who will not be pushed around by them. And particularly if the current outgoing defense minister, Boris Pistorius, replaces Scholz as leader of the Social Democratic Party in Germany, there will be some very strong people in Europe. Whether Macron survives as president or not. And the stronger the strong people are, the weaker the far-right populist parties will be. Because the greatest support is the belief that the old system, that the liberal democratic system is, because they buy into the Russian narrative, that it's feeble, that it's decrepit, that it is not capable of meeting a challenge, it's not capable of making sacrifices, it's not capable of renewing itself. All this is, a trick of mind. And once you change people's thinking about that, I think the electoral realities, the political realities in individual European countries will become more favorable.
There is a big risk that many are talking about. It's that EU might lean towards China if the US continues its tough stance on the EU. How likely is this?
I think this concern is exaggerated. The whole notion of either detaching Russia from China or China from Russia, this is an American fantasy. It has never had really deep roots in Europe. The Europeans, of course, like everyone else, have got into a position where China for years was approached on very benign, very favorable premises, and therefore certain trade dependencies have developed. I think increasingly there is more of a perception, first of all, in Europe. China and Russia are allies. China's objectives and its ambitions are not purely commercial, they are political. That China, as much as Russia, as much as Iran, as much as North Korea, wants to reformat the whole system of international relations. The Finns are going through this transition now, and it's very painful. And even if it doesn't develop thoroughly enough or quickly enough, I think these fantasies are not there, particularly this kind of geopolitical fantasy about separating the two. This is largely an American perspective. I'm not saying it doesn't exist in Europe, but do not exaggerate it. I think the biggest fallacy we would face comes from those in Europe who believe that without the United States, we will not be able to meet our essential security needs. That is the battle that's going to be more difficult to overcome than any concerns and illusions about China. Coming back to Trump again, but it also relates directly to Russia. What I think Trump wants to see is effectively, he won't use this vocabulary, a partition of Ukraine between one part, which is controlled or dominated by Russia, and another part, which is a vassal state of the United States, which is not a truly sovereign state, and which the United States basically owns. If you look at that initial minerals agreement that was presented to Zelensky on a take but a leave it basis, sign it today, and he rightly said, no, I won't. This is the kind of agreement presented by the Soviet Union to its Warsaw Pact allies in the past. So-called cooperation, but it basically means transferring control. And Zelensky said no. And any Ukrainian president who was a real Ukrainian would say no. And then what happened? The Americans started making compromises and backing away from a lot of this. And I think Trump might have reconsidered at the end, which is one reason this meeting with Zelensky went so badly. But, Trump wants to basically own the Ukrainian economy. The Russians would love to partition Ukraine. Putin initially proposed, of course, in Warsaw it's denied, but I have strong reasons to believe it is true, that he proposed that Poland and Russia partition Ukraine. This is, more or less the way Poland used to be a partition. This is the way the Russians think. Ukraine cannot live with this. It will no longer be Ukraine. It will no longer be independent in any sense worth talking about. Ukraine will not be in a position to make its own decision. All decisions will have to be made, and this has been the constant Russian demand going back to 1992, in consultation with Russia. Everything done jointly, meaning with Russian control. That's what it always means. There's a famous proposal of the Russians in the 1990s and then later to merge Ukrnaftogaz with Gazprom on an equal basis. And what the Russians meant is you control 5% and we control 95%. This is what they mean by merger.
Yes.
Nothing has changed. This is who they are. This is the whole Russian approach to things. The Russians will never accept, certainly not under anything bearing a resemblance to the current regime, that the Ukrainians are a different people and that Ukraine is a different country. They cannot accept it. This is one reason why they really expected Ukraine was going to collapse in something between 3 days and 3 weeks in 2022. So believe, I just have to add, because here Trump is important again. They firmly believe that Ukrainian statehood is simply a Western and by and large American project because there's no real basis inside Ukraine for anything of this nature. That this is all artificial.
How long Russia can continue the war?
It depends what we do. If we do what I think we can do, and we are not afraid to deploy the power we have and to develop the strengths we have, my view is they will not be able to continue it for very long. They are on borrowed time. But if we carry on as we have been, then Russia can accomplish most of its objectives. They still will not be able to destroy Ukraine because Ukraine will not agree to die. I am absolutely convinced of this. Um, so, the Russians don't understand Ukraine. I know years ago, in the early 90s, I was invited to write an article, which I did for whatever the journal was, published by the Carnegie Moscow Center. And the person who invited me for that said, please don't worry, I know what your views are and I want to publish them. And she said to me, I'm one of 6 people in the entire country who understand that Ukraine is not part of the Russian homeland.
Only 6.
Yeah, she said that she's Russian. I remember what Kissinger said in the early 1990s when I talked to him. He said, I've never once met a Russian who believed that Ukraine could be independent. These are very deeply rooted feelings. And the only way they will change is if Russia is conclusively defeated. And that will start a necessary conversation in Russia. And then one could be guardedly optimistic about the prospects for Russia and the prospects for change. But one of the problems we face with the so-called Russian opposition today is that, yes, most of it is sincerely committed to removing Putin, but they refuse to accept that the fundamental problem for others is the Russian imperial perspective, not only in Ukraine, but in Europe as a whole. And without addressing that, the relationship between Russia and Europe will never be satisfactory. It will always be a relationship of tension. It will always be a relationship that nobody else can trust, particularly countries on Russia's periphery. That is the fundamental problem. And very few people inside those who call themselves the Russian opposition understand their problem themselves and are willing to address it and speak about it.
Do you believe the EU and Ukraine can ensure this defeat of Russia?
Draw some lessons from the Prigozhin mutiny. Once it started, what happened in Russia? All the important people, they didn't do anything. They sat on the fence. They wanted to see how things were going to develop. They had no basic loyalty. If you take away the certainty that Putin has absolute power and can punish these people, they have no loyalty to him. They just looked at this and did nothing until it was clear that Prigozhin was going to lose. Then they supported Putin. Now, that's one lesson to be drawn. But the second lesson is that Prigozhin only did this. He was only supported to do this. He only had forces behind him because at that point they perceived that they were losing the war. A Russian army that believes it's winning the war will never turn on its masters. However many of them are killed, mutilated, wounded, ruined. They will never turn on their masters until they know they are defeated. Then they will. And in the Kremlin, they are afraid of this. And we should give them more reasons to be afraid of it. And we can. The Russian army can break. You know how many times in Russia's history the army is broken? There is this huge mythology in the West, which is, of course, fed and sustained by Russian narratives coming from Russia, that Russia cannot be defeated. Where's the evidence of this? Of course, Russia can be defeated, and it has, and the results have been often cataclysmic, and usually the result has been some form of regime change in Russia. So let's do it again, please.